August 15, 1945. Victory over Japan Day. Across America, celebrations erupted in streets from coast to coast. Sailors kissed strangers in Times Square, while factory workers who had built bombers and battleships finally allowed themselves to weep with relief. In prisoner of war camps from California to Mississippi, Japanese soldiers and auxiliary personnel prepared for repatriation to their defeated homeland. But at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, something unprecedented was unfolding. When Captain Meredith Sloan announced to a group of 73 Japanese women prisoners that they were free to return home, many of them did something that left American officials speechless. They asked to delay their departure. These were not ordinary prisoners. They were members of the Imperial Army Nursing Corps and the Women's Volunteer Labor Service, captured during the final chaotic months of the Pacific War. Young women who had served the Emperor in various capacities, now facing a choice that would define the rest of their lives. What could possibly make someone hesitate to return to their own country after years of captivity in enemy hands? Before we discover what happened to these remarkable women, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story begins 6 months earlier, in February 1945, when the first transport of Japanese women prisoners arrived at the hastily constructed facility adjacent to Camp Shelby's main compound. Unlike the male POW camps that housed thousands, this smaller enclosure held fewer than 80 women, ranging in age from 19 to 38. They had been captured in the Philippines and Okinawa as American forces pushed closer to the Japanese mainland, serving as nurses, radio operators, and administrative personnel for the Imperial forces. Captain Sloan, one of the few female officers assigned to oversee the facility, remembered her first encounter with the prisoners with crystalline clarity. The women descended from the transport trucks with expressions that mixed defiance with barely concealed terror. They wore remnants of their service uniforms, some still bearing the chrysanthemum insignia they had once worn with fierce pride. Their faces were gaunt from months of inadequate rations during their capture and transport, but their backs remained straight, their dignity intact despite their circumstances. Among them was 24-year-old Kazuko Yoshida, a trained nurse from Sendai who had volunteered for military service in 1943. She clutched a small silk pouch containing a photograph of her family and a letter from her younger brother, written before he shipped out to Saipan. She had no way of knowing if he still lived, if her family's home still stood, if anyone she loved had survived the firebombing campaigns that had turned Japanese cities into infernos. Standing in the Mississippi heat, surrounded by American soldiers speaking a language that sounded harsh to her ears, Kazuko made herself a promise. She would survive this captivity with honor, return to Japan, and rebuild whatever remained of her shattered world. She had no idea how completely that promise would be tested, transformed, and ultimately rewritten by what was about to unfold. The first weeks at Camp Shelby were marked by a tension so thick it seemed to hang in the humid Mississippi air like morning fog over rice paddies. The Japanese women kept to themselves, communicating only in hushed conversations during mealtimes, their words a mixture of formal Japanese and regional dialects that created a linguistic barrier even among themselves. They followed camp routines with mechanical precision, their movements efficient but guarded, as if expecting punishment for the slightest deviation from orders. Captain Sloan observed them carefully during those early days. She had studied Japanese culture as part of her officer training, learning about concepts like giri and on, duty and obligation that seemed to govern every interaction, but nothing in her textbooks had prepared her for the reality of these women's faces. They were not the fanatical enemies portrayed in wartime propaganda posters. They were exhausted, frightened young women who had been taught that capture meant dishonor worse than death, and who now faced each day wondering if they would be executed, tortured, or simply forgotten. The facility itself was Spartan but functional. Wooden barracks housed the women in groups of 12, with basic cots and thin blankets that proved inadequate against the surprising chill of Mississippi winter nights. A central mess hall served meals that were nutritionally adequate but utterly foreign to palates accustomed to rice, miso, and pickled vegetables. The women ate the potatoes, bread, and beef stew without complaint, but Captain Sloan noticed how they barely touched the food, taking only enough to sustain life, their faces reflecting a homesickness that went beyond mere nostalgia into something closer to soul-deep grief. Kazuko emerged quickly as an unofficial leader among the prisoners. Her medical training gave her authority, and her calm demeanor during their chaotic capture had earned respect from the other women. She spoke some English, learned during her nursing education, though she was careful not to reveal this skill to their captors immediately. Trust had to be earned, and she had been trained to believe that Americans were incapable of honor, that they would exploit any weakness, that survival meant maintaining absolute vigilance. Noriko Fujiwara, a 26-year-old communication specialist from Tokyo, became Kazuko's closest ally during those first difficult weeks. Noriko had worked as a radio operator, intercepting Allied communications and translating coded messages. She possessed a sharp, analytical mind and a dry wit that occasionally broke through the oppressive atmosphere of the barracks. Where Kazuko was reserved and cautious, Noriko was observant and questioning, constantly analyzing their captors' behavior for patterns that might reveal their true intentions. The guards maintained professional distance, following protocols that treated the women as military prisoners rather than civilians. But there was something in their eyes that confused Kazuko. She had expected hatred, perhaps even cruelty. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like discomfort, as if the American soldiers were as uncertain about this situation as the prisoners themselves were. Everything changed on a cold afternoon in early March. Private Cletus Drummond had never expected to end up guarding Japanese prisoners in Mississippi. The 22-year-old from Augusta, Georgia, had enlisted hoping to fight in Europe, perhaps see Paris or Rome before the war ended. Instead, he found himself stationed at Camp Shelby, assigned to a facility that most soldiers on base did not even know existed. His commanding officers had selected him specifically because of his even temperament and his family's reputation for hospitality. What they did not mention was that he would be guarding women who had served the empire that killed his cousin at Pearl Harbor. Cletus came from 4 generations of peach farmers. His grandfather had planted the first Alberta peach trees on their land in 1896, and the Drummond orchards had supplied fruit to half of Georgia ever since. He had grown up understanding that hospitality was not just politeness, but a moral obligation, that feeding someone who was hungry transcended politics or prejudice. His grandmother had taught him that you could judge a person's character by how they treated those who had nothing to offer in return. Watching the Japanese women during those first weeks troubled him deeply. They moved through the compound like ghosts, their faces carefully blank, their bodies held in rigid postures that spoke of constant vigilance. During meals, he noticed how they ate without pleasure, how they seemed to be simply going through motions of survival rather than living. It reminded him of the way his father's hunting dogs had looked after a brutal winter storm, had destroyed their kennel, traumatized and waiting for the next blow to fall. One evening in mid-March, Cletus was walking past the mess hall when he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. Singing. Soft, almost inaudible, but unmistakably human. He moved closer to the window and saw Kazuko sitting alone at one of the tables, holding a small photograph and humming a melody that sounded nothing like American music. The tune was haunting, built on scales that his ears could not quite process, rising and falling in patterns that felt ancient and profoundly sad. Tears ran down her face, but she made no sound beyond that quiet humming, as if she had learned to cry without letting anyone hear. Something shifted in Cletus in that moment. He thought about his own mother, who sang while she worked in the kitchen, and his sister Margaret, who hummed church hymns while hanging laundry. This woman was somebody's daughter, somebody's sister. The uniform she had worn, the country she had served, suddenly seemed less important than the simple human grief he was witnessing. The next morning, Cletus approached Private First Class Orville Tanner, the camp's head chef, with an unusual request. Orville, a stocky man from Dalton, who had worked in his family's restaurant before the war, listened with growing interest as Cletus explained his idea. By that afternoon, they had begun planning something that would violate no official regulations, but would challenge every assumption about how enemies were supposed to treat each other. The Peaches arrived at Camp Shelby on a mild afternoon in late March, shipped from the Drummond family orchards in Augusta. Cletus had written to his mother explaining that he wanted to do something kind for some people who were far from home, carefully avoiding any mention that these people were Japanese prisoners. His mother, understanding her son's heart, even through his careful wording, had sent 2 crates of preserved peaches along with her handwritten recipe for Georgia peach pie, the same recipe that had won blue ribbons at the county fair for 3 consecutive years. Private First Class Orville Tanner studied the recipe with the serious attention he gave to all culinary matters. He had been making do with military rations and whatever local supplies he could requisition. But this was different. This required precision, care, and a respect for tradition that went beyond simple cooking. He commandeered the camp kitchen on a quiet Sunday afternoon and began his work. The smell of butter, cinnamon, and caramelizing peaches soon filled the kitchen, a scent so powerfully evocative of home and comfort that soldiers passing by found themselves stopping to inhale deeply, their faces softening with memories of their own mother's kitchens. Captain Sloan had given her cautious approval to the plan, though she worried about how the gesture might be received. The Japanese women had begun to relax slightly in recent weeks, but they still maintained careful distance from their captors. Offering them a traditional American dessert might be seen as condescension, or worse, as some kind of psychological manipulation. But something in Cletus's earnest explanation of his grandmother's belief about hospitality had convinced her to allow the experiment. That evening, after the regular meal service, Orville and Cletus carried 8 freshly baked peach pies into the mess hall where the Japanese women were finishing their dinner. The room fell silent as the Americans entered. Kazuko's hand instinctively moved toward the small knife she used for eating, her body tensing for whatever might come next. The other women looked to her for guidance, their faces reflecting the same mix of confusion and wariness. Cletus set the first pie on the nearest table, the steam still rising from the golden latticed crust. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how inadequate his rehearsed words would sound. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Kazuko directly in English, knowing from Captain Sloan that she understood at least some of the language. "This is Georgia peach pie. It's what my family makes when we want to welcome someone. My grandmother says that nobody should be far from home without tasting something sweet." He had no way of knowing if she understood his words, but he saw her eyes move from his face to the pie, then back to his face. Orville cut a slice and placed it on a plate, setting it in front of Kazuko with a clean fork. Then both men stepped back, not hovering, not demanding gratitude or response, simply offering. Kazuko stared at the plate in front of her for what felt like an eternity. The warm slice of pie sat there, its latticed crust golden and fragrant, peach filling visible through the woven pastry. Around her, the other women watched in tense silence, waiting to see what she would do. Everything in her training told her to be suspicious, to refuse anything that was not required rations, to maintain the distance between prisoner and captor that preserved what little dignity remained to them. But the scent of cinnamon and peaches reminded her powerfully of something from her childhood. Her grandmother had made a sweet rice cake with preserved fruit during autumn festivals, a treat that appeared only once a year and was savored with ceremonial slowness. The memory hit her with unexpected force, bringing tears to her eyes that she quickly blinked away. She picked up the fork, her hand steady despite her racing thoughts, and took a small bite. The taste exploded across her tongue with a complexity she had not expected, Sweet but not cloying, the peaches tender and flavorful, the crust buttery and flaked perfectly. But more than the taste, it was the care that struck her. Someone had made this with attention and skill. Someone had thought that she and the other prisoners deserved something beyond mere survival rations. Someone had treated them as human beings worthy of hospitality. She looked up at Cletus and Orville, who stood awkwardly near the kitchen entrance, clearly uncertain whether they had committed some terrible cultural error. In halting English, choosing her words carefully, Kazuko spoke for the first time directly to an American soldier. "This is very good. Thank you." The words felt strange in her mouth. Gratitude offered to the enemy, but they also felt true in a way that transcended the war, the uniforms, the circumstances that had brought them all to this moment. The tension in the room broke like a dam releasing. The other women reached for the pies with careful hands, each taking a slice as if handling something precious. Noriko sat beside Kazuko and took her first bite, her eyes widening with surprise. "Kazuko," she whispered in Japanese, "it tastes like kindness." It was an odd thing to say, but Kazuko understood perfectly. The pie did not just taste sweet. It tasted like someone had cared enough to make something beautiful for people they had every reason to hate. Over the following days, something fundamental shifted in the compound. Cletus began greeting Kazuko with a simple "good morning" during his rounds, and she started responding with the Japanese equivalent "Ohayo gozaimasu," then teaching him the pronunciation when he attempted to repeat it. Other guards took notice and began their own small gestures. Sergeant Willis brought extra blankets when the nights turned cold. Corporal Anderson shared American magazines, pointing to pictures and teaching vocabulary words. The women began to smile occasionally, tentative and brief, but genuine. August 6, 1945 arrived with cloudless skies over Camp Shelby, but the news that filtered through military channels cast a shadow darker than any storm. A single American bomb had destroyed the city of Hiroshima, a weapon so powerful that it defied comprehension. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. The reports spoke of entire cities vaporized in seconds, of casualties numbering in the tens of thousands, of a new kind of warfare that made conventional bombing raids seem almost merciful by comparison. Captain Sloan faced an impossible dilemma. She could not hide this news from the Japanese women indefinitely, but she also had no idea how to deliver information that would devastate them. Many of the prisoners had families in or near those cities. Some, like Noriko, had relatives working in Nagasaki's industrial facilities. The announcement would not just be news of their country's defeat. For some, it would be news of unimaginable personal loss. She called the women together in the mess hall on the morning of August 10th. The prisoners filed in with the usual quiet discipline, but something in the captain's face told them this was different. Kazuko felt her stomach tighten with dread. Captain Sloan stood before them, her normally composed features showing strain that even military bearing could not hide. Through Kazuko, who had become the unofficial translator, she delivered the news as gently as possible. But there was no gentle way to describe atomic devastation. The reaction was not what the American staff expected. There were no screams, no outbursts of rage or grief. Instead, a terrible silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of someone's sharp intake of breath, another's muffled sob quickly stifled. The Japanese women seemed to fold into themselves, their faces becoming masks that revealed nothing, while their eyes reflected everything. Noriko stood slowly, her movements mechanical, and walked toward the door. Captain Sloan nodded to let her go. One by one, other women followed, returning to their barracks in stunned silence. Kazuko remained seated, staring at nothing. Her family lived in Sendai, far from either targeted city, but her cousin had married a man from Hiroshima. Her best friend from nursing school had taken a position at a hospital in Nagasaki. The scope of destruction Captain Sloan described meant that there was no possibility of survival for anyone near the blast centers. She thought about her promise to return home and rebuild. What home? What was there to rebuild when entire cities could be erased in seconds? That night, Cletus walked past the barracks and heard something that haunted him for the rest of his life. The sound of 73 women weeping together, not loudly, but in a collective grief that seemed to come from somewhere beyond individual sorrow. He stood in the darkness, listening, and found tears running down his own face. He thought about his family's peach orchards, imagining them vaporized in an instant, everything his grandfather built simply gone. The days following the atomic bomb announcements transformed the atmosphere at Camp Shelby in ways no one could have predicted. The Japanese women moved through their routines like sleepwalkers, their earlier progress toward trust and connection seemingly erased by the magnitude of their nation's defeat and the horror of what had been unleashed upon their homeland. Captain Sloan worried they might retreat entirely into themselves, that the fragile bridges built over months might collapse under the weight of this new reality. But something unexpected happened instead. The American soldiers, rather than celebrating their victory with the triumphalism that marked celebrations elsewhere in the country, seemed sobered by what their nation had done. Cletus found himself unable to feel joy at the war's end. He kept thinking about the children who must have been in those cities, the family sitting down to breakfast when the world turned to fire. Victory felt hollow when purchased at such a terrible price. It was Orville who first broke through the wall of grief. 3 days after the surrender announcement, he appeared in the mess hall with another batch of peach pies, this time accompanied by a simple statement delivered through Kazuko's translation. "My mama always said that sorrow shared is sorrow halved. She also said that nobody should grieve alone without something sweet to remind them that life still has goodness in it." He set the pies on the tables and left quietly, not waiting for thanks or acknowledgement. That evening, Kazuko did something she had never done before. She sought out Cletus during his rounds and spoke to him in careful English. "Private Drummond, I want to say something to you and to the other soldiers here. We came to this place believing you were demons. We were taught that Americans had no honor, no humanity, only cruelty and hatred for anyone different from themselves. Everything we experienced here has shown us that we were lied to about many things." She paused, gathering her courage for what came next. "I think perhaps we were not the only ones who were lied to. I think maybe you were also taught things about us that were not true." Cletus nodded slowly. "Ma'am, I reckon you're right about that. Before I met you and the other ladies here, I thought all Japanese people were just like the propaganda posters. I'm ashamed to say I didn't think of you as regular folks with families and homes and dreams like everybody else. But watching you all these past months, seeing how you care for each other, how you keep your dignity even when everything is hard, it's taught me something important. War makes enemies out of people who should never have been enemies in the first place." The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it marked another turning point. Word spread among both the prisoners and the guards that Kazuko had spoken openly about the lies both sides had been told. Other women began their own tentative conversations with American soldiers, asking questions about their homes, their families, their lives before the war. September brought the first letters from Japan, delivered through international Red Cross channels that had finally been reestablished after the surrender. Captain Sloan distributed them during morning assembly, calling each woman's name and handing over the thin envelopes that had traveled thousands of miles carrying news that could bring either relief or devastation. Some women received multiple letters, others received none at all, and the absence of mail spoke volumes about what might have happened to their families. Kazuko's hands trembled as she opened the single letter addressed to her. It was from her younger sister Akiko, written in the careful script their mother had taught them both. The words were measured, factual, as if emotion had been deliberately drained from them to make the content bearable. Their parents had survived. The house in Sendai still stood, though much of the city around it had been destroyed by conventional bombing raids that preceded the atomic attacks. Her brother had not returned from Saipan and was presumed dead. Her cousin in Hiroshima was confirmed dead, along with her husband and their 2 children. Food was scarce, work was scarce. Hope was scarcer still. The letter concluded with a sentence that struck Kazuko with unexpected force. "Sister, if you have found any safety where you are, perhaps it is better you stay there for now. There is nothing here but hunger and grief and the shame of defeat. At least where you are, you can still imagine that somewhere in the world, life continues as it should." Kazuko read those words 3 times, trying to understand what her sister was really saying. Was this permission? Was it abandonment? Was it simply the truth spoken plainly by someone too exhausted for false comfort? Noriko's news was worse. She received no letter at all, but the Red Cross provided a brief notation that her entire family had been in Nagasaki on August 9th. There were no survivors to write letters, no home to return to, no one waiting for her arrival. She sat on her bunk holding the notification slip, her face completely blank, and said nothing for 2 days. Kazuko and the other women stayed close to her, not speaking, just present, offering the only comfort possible in the face of such absolute loss. Throughout the barracks, similar scenes unfolded. Of the 73 women in the camp, 18 received no letters at all. 26 learned of family deaths. Only 12 received news that could be considered hopeful, and even those letters were filled with descriptions of hardship that made their current imprisonment seem almost comfortable by comparison. Japan was starving. Cities lay in ruins. The occupation forces were arriving, and no one knew what that would mean for daily life. The women who had served the emperor's military now faced the possibility of being seen as collaborators or criminals by the very forces that had defeated them. That night, as the women gathered for their evening meal, Kazuko noticed something that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. Several of the Japanese prisoners were sitting with American soldiers, sharing tables, sharing conversation in broken mixtures of English and Japanese, sharing the burden of an uncertain future that now somehow seemed to include them all. August 20th, 1945, arrived with the bureaucratic efficiency that characterized all military operations. The repatriation orders were final, the transportation schedules confirmed, the displaced persons processing centers in occupied Japan prepared to receive the returning prisoners. Captain Sloan had called a final assembly for 900 hours, where she would formally announce the departure procedures and answer any remaining questions. The Japanese women, dressed in the cleaned and mended versions of their original uniforms, preparing to return to their homeland with whatever dignity they could maintain. But as the women filed into the mess hall that morning, Kazuko carried something unexpected. Wrapped carefully in cloth was a small ceramic sake cup that one of the guards had procured from a Japanese cultural center in nearby Hattiesburg. It was not authentic sake, but rather apple cider that Orville had prepared, the closest approximation to ceremonial drink that American ingredients could provide. Kazuko had spent the previous evening teaching the other women the words to a traditional blessing ceremony, one used in Japan to honor those who had shown extraordinary kindness to strangers. Captain Sloan began her announcement with the formal language required by military protocol, outlining departure times, processing procedures, and the support services that would be available to them upon arrival in Japan. But before she could finish, Kazuko stood and approached the front of the room. "Captain Sloan, with your permission, we would like to say something before we leave." The captain nodded, curiosity and concern mixing on her face as she stepped aside. Kazuko gestured, and the 73 women stood in unison. They had practiced this the night before, perfecting their movements until they flowed with the precision of their military training, but the grace of something far older. They bowed deeply, holding the position for a full count of 5, a gesture of respect reserved in Japanese culture for the most profound gratitude. Then, In voices that harmonized with unexpected beauty, they began to sing a traditional Japanese blessing song, one typically reserved for honored guests and revered elders. The American soldiers in the room stood frozen, many of them recognizing this as something sacred, even if they could not understand the words. Cletus felt tears on his cheeks as he listened to the haunting melody, so different from anything in his experience, yet somehow universally comprehensible as an expression of deep emotion. When the song concluded, Kazuko switched to English, her voice clear and steady, despite the emotion behind her words. Captain Sloan, Private Drummond, Private First Class Tanner, and all the American soldiers here, we came to this place as your enemies. You treated us as human beings. We expected cruelty. You showed us kindness. We were taught you were demons. You proved to be men and women of honor and compassion. In our language, we have just sung a blessing for you. We have asked that your orchards always bear fruit, that your families remain healthy, that your lives be filled with peace and prosperity. We call you something in Japanese that we never thought we would call Americans. We call you tomodachi, friends. She held up the sake cup and took a ritual sip, then passed it to Noriko, who did the same. The cup moved through the ranks of Japanese women, each taking a sip and bowing toward the American soldiers who had been their captors and had somehow become something more. 20 years later, in the spring of 1965, Kazuko Yoshida Drummond stood in her garden in Augusta, Georgia, carefully tending a row of peach trees that would have made her late father-in-law proud. She had married Cletus 3 years after returning to Japan, immigrating to America through sponsorship programs designed to reunite families separated by war. Their 2 children, Margaret and James, played in the yard behind her, their laughter carrying the music of a future neither parent could have imagined during those uncertain months at Camp Shelby. The journey from prisoner to immigrant had not been simple. Kazuko had returned to Japan in September 1945, finding exactly the devastation her sister's letter had described. She worked as a nurse in Sendai, helping survivors cope with radiation sickness, starvation, and the psychological trauma of total defeat. The work was necessary but soul-crushing, made bearable only by the letters that arrived monthly from Mississippi. Cletus wrote about the peach harvest, about his family's questions regarding the Japanese women he had guarded, about his growing conviction that the kindness shown at Camp Shelby had changed him in ways he was still discovering. In 1947, Cletus traveled to Japan as part of a civilian agricultural exchange program, ostensibly to teach Japanese farmers about American cultivation techniques. But everyone who knew him understood the real reason for his journey. He and Kazuko spent 3 weeks talking, walking through the ruins of Sendai, visiting the graves of her brother and cousin, discussing the possibility of a future together despite everything that should have made such a future impossible. When he proposed marriage in front of her parents' home, using carefully rehearsed Japanese phrases, she said yes without hesitation. Their wedding in 1948 scandalized some in both countries. American veterans groups protested the marriage of a former guard to a former enemy prisoner. Japanese traditionalists saw her choice as a betrayal of her nation and her culture. But Captain Sloan, now retired Major Sloan, attended the ceremony in Sendai, along with Orville Tanner and 6 other soldiers who had served at Camp Shelby. Their presence sent a powerful message about the bonds that had been formed in that unlikely place. Noriko had taken a different path. Having lost her entire family to the atomic bomb, she chose to dedicate her life to peace advocacy and reconciliation work. She never married, instead becoming a translator for the Allied occupation forces and later for the United Nations. She traveled between America and Japan, sharing the story of Camp Shelby at schools, conferences, and government assemblies. Her testimony about the transformative power of small acts of kindness influenced post-war policies toward reconciliation and displaced persons programs that helped thousands of others find new homes and new purposes. Of the 73 women who had been imprisoned at Camp Shelby, 42 eventually immigrated to the United States, most within the first decade after the war. They became nurses, teachers, business owners, and mothers, contributing to American communities while maintaining connections to their Japanese heritage. They formed an informal network, gathering annually at reunions where they shared peach pie and told their children stories about the cowboys from Georgia, who taught them that enemies could become family.